Well, last week I did a show called The Boeing Effect, which I basically described as the process of an organization or a company getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of the things that made it successful in the first place eventually get lost. Accountability goes away, discipline goes away, accounting goes away. All of the stuff that made it successful goes away. And I talked about how that also applies to our government as well. But there is another side to this story. Not everything is completely awful, although I prepare myself for this every day. There is, in fact, at least one government agency that I'm aware of that still has my undying respect, at least as I record this now anyway. And they are the champions of rigor. And they are the flip side of the Boeing effect. And they have produced the greatest miracle of the modern age, in my opinion, and no one talks about it ever. If somebody were to uncork me from my frozen pickled head in the year 3942 and ask me what was the greatest achievement of your age, it'd be tempting, of course, to mention the space program and the Apollo landings, but actually, technically, that's not it. The greatest achievement of our age is that we have flown for 20 years now, something like 50,000 flights a day in this country, and we have never had a crash of a major jetliner on an American carrier in this country. In 20 years, we've never had one go in, not one, ever. That is the kind of number that I thought was statistically impossible to achieve, but we've achieved it. And the reason we've achieved it is because of rigor. And the agency that maintains rigor, at least in the government that I look out there today, is the National Transportation Safety Board. Now, I don't know anything about the rest of the National Transportation Safety Board in terms of what they do with highway accidents or any of the rest of it, but I do know a little bit about what they do with aviation. So let's talk about what the NTSB investigative teams do and why what they do has given us this miraculous, unprecedented, inconceivable result. 20 years without a plane crash of a major carrier here in the U.S. How did this happen? How did it happen? Well, it happened for two reasons. The first thing that happened was we went out there and made a lot of mistakes. And as I've said many times before, you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And this is the reason why SpaceX succeeds and Blue Origin fails. SpaceX succeeds because they go out there and explode rockets and they find out something new. And presumably, judging by their progress, they don't make that mistake again. And if they don't make that mistake again, that allows them to go out there and make new mistakes that happen downstream of that mistake. And if you do this often enough and you apply rigorous thinking, honest, rigorous thinking to it, then you will eventually succeed. Now, Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, on the other hand, have not flown anything like the number of flights. And since they don't fly the flights, they don't find the errors. Since they don't find the errors, they have less confidence in the vehicle. Since they have less confidence in the vehicle, they fly fewer flights. And now Jeff Bezos is trying to sue his way to the moon by basically blocking NASA from awarding the lunar contract to SpaceX because SpaceX is succeeding because they fail and Blue Origin is failing because they sue. The difference between these two companies is a difference of rigor. But back to the NTSB. Maybe the reason that agency is so successful is because it's so small. Again, I'm not talking about the Department of Transportation. I'm not talking even about the other things that the NTSB might do. I'm talking about their air accident investigation duties, which have been astonishing in their rigor. So what does rigor mean? What is the actual meaning of this term that is so important to all of us? It is absolutely critical to the survival of this society as we see it, as we know it, to maintain and re-attain standards of rigor. So what is rigor? The definition I'm talking about is rigor, or rigor, as the British would spell it, and they define it as the quality of being extremely thorough, exhaustive, or accurate. That's why we haven't had plane crashes in this country for 20 years. Now, what does an NTSB accident report consist of? Well, it consists of absolutely flinty-eyed, dispassionate, relentless attempts to figure out what went wrong. And we obviously think about big events like airline crashes or things like the shuttle disaster or all the rest of it. But most of what the NTSC does, and they do it on a daily basis, I'm sad to say, is investigate general aviation accidents. And most of those are pretty commonplace. You put pretty much all of the general aviation accidents into 1 or 2, 3 bins, something like that at the very most. One of the oldest sayings in aviation is that aviation regulations are written in blood, and it's absolutely true. 100%. Absolutely true. A flight crew does something, and you realize, my God, the cause of this was this, and therefore we don't do that again. Great example is the crash of the Air Florida 737 coming out of Reagan, and just took off, went into the Potomac, didn't climb. The pilots were having a conversation about something else. They were talking about seniority. They were talking about something other than what they needed to do to get ready to take off in these icy conditions. And so that plane went into the river and a number of people died. Now, what did we learn from this? Well, we learned that this kind of distraction is common and that it has caused other accidents in the past and has caused some near misses as well. So the NTSB mandated a law that was enforced by the Federal Aviation Administration, which is an entirely different animal, that basically said something to the effect of this. From this point forward, you are by law required to tell your pilots that they are not allowed to talk about anything other than what is directly relevant to this stage of the flight during certain critical periods of time, and that would be prior to takeoff, prior to landing, and so on. They call it the sterile cockpit, and it's called a sterile cockpit because we don't allow anything into the cockpit at these critical times when distractions can get people killed. Now, when you're established at 37,000 feet in cruise, get the autopilot on, everything's humming, then you can talk about girlfriends and wives and insurance policies and all the rest. But when you're in a situation where seconds count, and everything has to be done correctly, you're not allowed to do that. You just simply can't. It's against the law. And you can be fired for it. You should be fired for it. And one of the reasons why we've got the safety record is because of things like the sterile cockpit rule. As a matter of fact, that particular dynamic of saying human nature is to relax your standards when you've done something long enough, especially well enough. If you've done enough of these things well over time, you can begin to think, well, okay, I guess it's pretty much automatic. And sterile cockpit philosophy has been taken from the jetliner flight deck into the operating room in hospitals. And the number of accidental deaths from surgery, the number of times that people have gone in for a leg amputation, I've got a gangrenous right leg, so I go to the hospital and they remove my left leg. That kind of accident has fallen precipitously in medicine because of something that we learned from guys who went into the Potomac River. This is what rigor is. Rigor is discipline. It's mental discipline, and it's more than that. It is the courage to face the outcome of what you have learned through that mental discipline. Now, I have 1,000 hours of flight time, an instrument rating, and I've been in a couple of dicey situations. But one of the reasons I'm still here is because I relentlessly read aviation accident reports. Voraciously read them. More so when I was flying more often, but still. So why would I do that? Why would a guy who's going to get up in a small private airplane and fly around read as much as he could about other guys who got up into small private airplanes and flew around and ended up getting killed? You would think that you would want to shy away from that kind of thing, and many pilots do. Many pilots don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it. I'm not like that. One of the first things I was told by my brilliant primary flight instructor named Jeff Larkin, hey Jeff, is this. And it's an old aviation saw, he didn't come up with this. But one of the things we say in flight training is, son, you better learn from the mistakes of others because you're not going to live long enough to make them all yourself. And time again, I would find myself in a situation where I was trying to make a decision about something. And that part of my brain that wanted to drop the rigor, I kind of need to get there, it's a nice day, it's not a really big deal, it'll probably be fine, all of it, maybe the weather will clear, I'll go see, all of this stuff. Whenever I find myself thinking that way, I think back to these reports. Now, of these NTSC reports on fatalities, in general aviation, not in civil airliners, I know 2 of those reports that I read where I knew the pilots, they weren't close friends, but I knew them pretty well. And I took a close look at how both of these guys got killed. and I filed away what they did. And I have, so far, managed to not make that mistake again. That's what rigor is. It's discipline plus courage, plus intellect, plus resolve, will, the determination to change as a result of what you've learned. Now, when you look at the kind of accidents that we used to have quite frequently in aviation, civil aviation, you can put a lot of them into the bin of pilot error. I'm going to interrupt here just to say that one of my favorite YouTube channels is called the Flight Channel. I'll throw a link in the description below. Basically, what it does is use flight simulator software and recreate various civil accidents, as long as there's been civil accidents. It's very restrained, it's very clinical, it's very rigorous, it's well-researched. It's written by a person whose English is not his first language, so there are occasional spelling errors, but by and large, it's a remarkable channel. And actually watching the airplanes, and as the flight simulators like Microsoft Flight Simulator get more and more and more believable, that sense of having been there flying along the wing of an airplane that's about to go down has gotten more and more realistic. I'm a huge fan of the Flight Channel on YouTube. And so what you find when you look at these kind of accidents is that virtually all of them fall into a number of relatively small categories. Pilot error. Well, what does that mean? Sometimes you'll find, especially watching the Flight Channel videos, you'll find that the pilots in command of that aircraft were arrogant beyond any human measure. Absolutely 100% vain, arrogant, stupid men who killed themselves and their passengers because they simply thought that they were above the ability to make a human mistake. Sometimes you run into accident reports that have to do with mechanical failures, and most of those mechanical failures are the result of a maintenance error that occurred somewhere upstream. The Alaska flight of that 717 that went inverted off the coast of California, not far from here, just off of Point Mugu. Horrific example of a runaway elevator trim that caused the airplane to nose down, and they couldn't untrim it. The pilots of that aircraft both were awarded posthumous awards for magnificent airmanship. By the time that they had found out that this thing was getting worse and worse and worse, the airplane was pitched down to such a degree, and they couldn't adjust it, couldn't just turn off the breakers. It was a mechanical problem, that they were trying to fly that plane inverted. And the entire time, from the moment they first realized something was wrong until the moment they hit the Pacific Ocean, the entire time, that flight crew was working the problem and doing everything that they could possibly do in order to save that airplane. Well, turned out that that particular crash was caused by insufficient lubrication of the worm screw that sets the attitude of the stabilizer that determines pitch attitude. So they increased the amount of supervision on key maintenance items like that one, and we haven't had that kind of crash since then. A third kind of category is exceedingly rare, and that's the, hey, tough luck kid, where something just out of the blue happens. But to be perfectly honest with you, those are virtually unheard of. It's almost never a case of everything flying along just fine, then suddenly, hey, tough break, kid. It's something preventable. And the thing I like the most about the NTSB is their immunity from political pressure. There is one or perhaps two possible exceptions to this that are up in the air, if you'll pardon the expression. But as a general rule, the NTSB report is absolutely unflinching when it comes to assigning blame. Now, one of the reasons that we're getting better at this is because we're figuring out who made the mistake. Not so much to punish the people involved, because to be perfectly honest with you, most of the people who should be punished for the mistakes died in the accident. But there have been several times when the NTSB report indicated something that other people didn't like. Maybe a company, Boeing didn't like it, Airbus didn't like it. I remember there was a crash of an Egypt Air flight where the pilot basically waited for the co-pilot to go to the bathroom, locked the door, and then flew the jet into the ground. The Egyptian government didn't like that very much and fought that story hard. But there it was on the cockpit voice recorder. I put my trust in God. I think he said that something like 13 times. The flight data recorder, the black box, which is another invention designed to prevent future accidents by recording what happens during the present, showed that the airplane was just fine. Sometimes we see software errors. We're seeing more of these now where the airplane will suddenly just go out of control because of a software glitch. Something's reading a sensor the wrong way, and the plane will suddenly just go into a nose-high attitude or whatever the case may be. On and on and on. But we learn, and so we get better. Now we come to kind of the larger point about rigor. Rigor is essential for progress, and I don't mean progressivism. I mean the opposite of progressivism. I mean actual progress. Write this down because this is important. Lowering test score standards makes people stupider. I'll just wait while you underline those words. Lowering test score standards makes people stupider. Well, how can you say that? Well, it's pretty simple, really. If you have a standard that has to be achieved, and you fall short of that standard consistently, you're falling short of that standard that has been established prior because whatever you need to reach that standard, you're not getting. You're not getting enough education, not getting enough training, not getting enough anything. Here's the standard of what people have done before. This is the standard of excellence or even the standard of mediocrity for that matter. It's a standard. And when people stop coming up to that standard, it's because they're not getting what they needed to cross that bar. So when you lower the bar, which is all we do now today, is lower the bar everywhere. When you lower the bar, you are now saying that people with less education can move on. And as the bar gets lower and lower, the amount of things you need to know, the amount of training you have to get or whatever, becomes less and less and less. And so people get stupider and stupider and stupider. If they would raise the bar slowly, but continuously, we'd get smarter and smarter and smarter. But we don't. You know why? Because raising the bar is harder than lowering the bar. That's why. So, just to wrap this up, if you could imagine a world, and I can imagine a world, where the standards of the NTSB, these champions of rigor, were applied to everything, think about what would happen if people with the rigorous attitude of the NTSB aviation accident investigation teams were to suddenly do what they do all the time, which is get a phone call in the middle of the night, have their bags are pre-packed, they get on a plane, and they go to the scene of the accident. What if those people were to go to Detroit, for example? And what if you were to apply that kind of rigorous thinking to some of our social problems? What would that look like? Well, it would look like an aviation accident investigation. The first thing they would do is examine the wreckage. That's the first thing you do when there's been a crash. You examine the wreckage. And if they went to Detroit, they would go around and examine the wreckage. How much damage has been done? How bad is the damage? How widespread is the damage? And in Detroit, it's pretty widespread. They'd find the Mark Twain Library, which is utterly destroyed. Money was set aside for maintenance of that, but that comes later. What they see when they walk in, when they're looking at the crash site, is a once magnificent library with classical architecture and oak bookshelves is now utterly trashed, and everything is taken, including the wire, out of the walls because you can sell that copper for a few bucks. And the only thing left in the library are the books, which are rotting on the ground in the water. So they would look around at Detroit and they would survey the damage. And then they would start to do what they always do, which is let's wind this clock backwards and find out how what used to be a nice, bright, shiny airplane turned into 3.5 miles of aluminum tatters and pieces of luggage and body parts and all the rest. And if they wound the clock back the way they would, they'd begin to discover the decisions that were made that created the accident in the first place. And they would be able to say things like, okay, so this library got money to fix the roof, but the roof didn't get fixed. Why? That's the job of the NTSB. Why? Why did this happen? Well, I guess somebody diverted the funds and kept it. Okay. We're going to find out who that is because that's important, because punishing the person that did it deters people downstream, but that's not the main reason they're there. The main reason they're there is to find the mechanism. So it's a question of corruption? Yes. Low-level corruption? Yes. The money was allocated for the maintenance? Yes, but it didn't get there. Correct. Okay. So it's not a funding problem. No. It's a distribution problem. Yes. And if you were to apply that rigorous thinking to an investigation of Detroit, what you would find is you would find that all of the ruin in Detroit was caused by a series of cascading decisions, and you would find out what the cause of those decisions were because you already know what the outcome of those decisions was. That's what rigor would do for us. That sense of accountability and rigor produces results. And that's why we live in this age of miracles. That's why getting on an aircraft is the safest thing you can do in this country today. It's safer than taking a shower. Lots of people have been killed falling in the bathtub just this year. Nobody's been killed on a jetliner this year. Or the last 20 years.